He's a professor of globalization and director of Oxford Martin School. He's going to be examining the opportunities arising from social and technological changes, as well as considering the risks we've heard quite a lot about already, but risks from social dislocation to systemic financial failure. He's a fascinating character, and I had the pleasure of getting to know him a little bit yesterday. What I didn't realise until I met him yesterday, that he's originally from Pretoria in South Africa, and I did have to tell him that the last keynote speaker, who I introduced on a very large conference platform from Pretoria, did go on to murder his girlfriend just a few weeks later, who was, of course, Oscar Pistorius. I don't think that he's going to be following in his footsteps, and I think he knows an awful lot more about globalization than Oscar Pistorius. So please give a big welcome. Oh, I should add, apologies, that this session, that this session has been very kindly sponsored by Touchstone Underwriting and XL Catlin. You're going to be hearing a bit more about them later. But for now, please welcome Professor Ian Goldin.
Thanks very much, Daisy. It's a tough act to follow Justin, who so brilliantly captured where we are in the world and gave so many amusing anecdotes. What I want to take you through is a slightly longer-term perspective of the next 20 years or so, thinking about both the opportunities and risks and bringing in technology and other areas. So the key thing about this time we live in is to think about it as a new renaissance, a period of enormous positive change and negative change. I'll run through the demographic changes, the economic changes, and technological changes, come back to risk, and then talk about a few things that might impact on ABTA and its members. This is the period when walls come down. Walls around the world are coming down. Over the last 25 years, 65 countries have become democratic. But it's not only political walls, it's economic walls, it's the walls that inform your work, where people go, where they come from, and the opportunities. So this period of hyperconnectivity is different to any period in history. It's a period where changes are happening at a pace which is unimaginable. As Daisy mentioned, I grew up in Pretoria. I left. I thought I would never go back in my lifetime. I was living in Paris, and then one day I was invited to dinner there with President Mandela, who was released after 25 years in prison. A miracle that in that moment, I realized, resulted from the wall coming down. And that's what's happening everywhere. The pace of change is greater, and what impacts us starts somewhere else. So when we think about the future, let's not think about what's going to come out of the UK. Let's think about what will come from somewhere else. The multiple dimensions of it and the pace of change. But what the Arab Spring teaches us is that this is not simply more and more openness, more and more connectivity. It's more and more uncertainty. It's like a roller coaster ride with sharp ups and downs and surprises, white knuckle rides all the time. Surprise, surprise, surprise. And the question about managing and navigating in this period is, can you manage with uncertainty? Can you work out what's going to happen before your competitors? Can you make sure that you anticipate the changes and manage risk? Are you resilient? So it's this question of how we understand increasingly uncertain worlds. Because the walls have come down, there are 2 billion more people in the world. Ideas have traveled that lead people to live longer lives. Simple ideas like washing your hands prevents contagious diseases, wearing bed nets stops malaria. Very complicated ideas like new vaccinations, new cures for cancer. And these are traveling at greater pace. So just while you're here for 2 days, your average life expectancies will improve by about 8 hours. Just don't drink too much. Don't smoke too much, and you'll be above the averages. That's the pace of progress because of what we're learning and because of what's happening in the labs. 2 billion more people, a lot more congested, a lot more connected, and that's the dynamism of growth. That's why we are seeing the most rapid pace of innovation ever. Because not just connected people, literate people. People around the world who are connecting and getting ideas and sharing ideas, and so the pace of innovation is growing. Good ideas, but bad ideas too. ISIS is the biggest social media user in terms of recruitment of foreign soldiers since the Spanish Civil War recruited over 30,000 people using social media. More scientists alive today than all the scientists that ever lived in history. More educated people alive today than all the educated people that ever lived in history. More doctorates being produced in China than all the doctorates in the world. That's the engine of change. So we don't know what's next, but we know it's going to be exciting. There'll be a lot more Einstein, Shakespeare's, changes which will be for the better, but also evil genius unleashed. All sorts of shocks that will come into our system. 80% of the world now connected, depicted in yellow here, and this period of extraordinary change. The red line, income growth, exponential. The green line, population growth, arithmetic, more rapid than any period in history. And the question about what next is this sustainable? Will these lines keep going up? Will population keep going up? Will income keep going up? Or is this some aberration in history? That's the question. And I believe it is sustainable if we manage it. It's an extraordinary time to be alive. It's by far the best time in history to be alive. All of our chances of leading longer, healthier lives are greater than any generation that went before us. And that's particularly true if you're born poor. One's chances of escaping poverty are greater than ever in history. And that's because of this connectivity. It's because of the literacy. It's because of enormous progress that's happening. And that's why, like Justin, I'm an incredible optimist. I believe that this is a time of opportunity. So we think about it, and we're often depressed, but this is the new Renaissance. This is the period of creativity which scales that, but many times more and much more global. A period where we'll see the most remarkable artistic creativity, the learning about ourselves in relation to the world, and of course, scientific invention. Copernicus discovering that we went around the sun, not the other way around. So revelations that change our world in really fundamental ways, coming out of a technology like the Gutenberg press, the internet. That led to millions of books being printed and millions more political pamphlets in the first year. Before that, only monks with handwritten scripts shared ideas. Less than 1% of the world was literate. We went to a world where over half was. But it ended in tears. The bonfire of the vanities, the burning of books, the destruction of presses, fundamentalism, extremism, religious wars, and actually had no long-term impact on economic growth in the world. And the question of our time is, are we better at managing revolutionary technological change than they were in the Renaissance? Are we better able to ensure that this does lead to sustained progress? And there are two things I worry about. The first is that while the walls have gone down between societies, within societies, they're growing everywhere in the world. All societies are experiencing rapidly rising inequality. And that's because the progress is so rapid that if you're not educated, if you don't have the housing mobility, if you're not able to benefit from these changes, you are left further and further behind. And so the gulfs are widening everywhere. And the second worry is systemic risk. When we connect, not only good stuff connects, really bad stuff connects too. And as we saw with the financial crisis, the super spreaders of these new technologies, like the big banks, or like the server farms, or like our big airports, are also the super spreaders of the bads. A pandemic traveling through a big airport can be anywhere in the world now in 48 hours. A collapse of a big bank will lead to a global financial crisis. A cyber attack can bring down systems around the world instantaneously. And so the question of this hyperconnectivity is, how do we connect goods, but not bads? How do we open our doors and have wonderful sunlight and good things coming through, but not terrorism, pandemics, and other bad things? And this challenge is the challenge of managing in a hyper-globalized world, of ensuring that we're able to harvest these benefits and not be victim to them. Let me whiz through demographic, economic, and technological change and then come back to these. You had Sarah Harper last year, and Sarah runs one of my groups focusing on demographic change. In the Oxford Martin School, we have 30 groups working on big challenges of the future, and demographics under Sarah is one of them. Well, as you would have heard from her, the demographers don't really know what's happening. They don't know whether the world's population will be 12 billion or 9 billion in 35 years' time. Quite extraordinary range of uncertainty. 3 billion only 35 years out. They all agree in increasing life expectancy, about 2 years a decade at least, but some people believe it's going to be much more rapid because of the technological marvels that are happening. When you compound these numbers, you get huge numbers of aged people. 700 million people over the age of 65 in Asia alone within the next 10 years. When one's thinking travel, it's going to be increasingly elderly travel. Even more dramatic than the increase in longevity is the collapse in fertility everywhere. Over half the countries in the world now below replacement level. And that means the demographics of the future look very different. Median ages doubling in all countries. So the future is with the elderly. Now, with current technologies, there's a 90% probability of neurodegenerative diseases at age 90, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and dementia. So we find working, being productive until our 80s, but then we hit, if you're my age, the brick wall. And so we worry a lot at my age about these things. The young people don't have to worry. These will be cured. And the question for society is, how do you carry this? So we need to remove from our mental maps ideas of population pyramids and put in place this sort of structure. I hope you see it as a vase that you put flowers into, but I look at it and see a coffin standing up. This is the structure of the future. Lots of detail, which is important in here. What jumps out of this, of course, is what women all know, which men deny, which is women are wiser than men. Women live longer everywhere. They're born to live to the same age, but they live longer. Why? Because they don't make as many stupid decisions. They don't stick as many knives into each other. They don't smoke as much. They don't drink as much. They don't drive as many cars into as many other cars, and they live longer. This is a global phenomenon. So a lot of elderly women who are singles, but many to many young boys being born everywhere because we have the technologies to choose and where societies reward boys more than girls, status, career, income, etc. People choose to have boys. And so you have the skewed distribution around the world and, of course, an elderly domination. And they dominate the politics. They make the young people pay high taxes. But when these packages of pensions and retirements were built, average life expectancy on retirement was 7 years, and average real risk-adjusted returns were 4%. Now average life expectancy on retirement is already 27 years, and real risk-adjusted returns, if you invest with Justin, I'm sure you'll get at least 0.5% real. You have to save 100 times more for the same standard of living when you're elderly. Where's the money going to come from? What's it going to do to consumption? How's it going to affect people's holiday choices? Where's it going to go to? What asset classes? Is it all going to go into property? Where? These make fundamental differences at the individual level, at the macro level, at the national level, and at the global balances level. Every country is different. China, unusual because of the one-child policy, much more skyscraper structure. But the gender distribution is skewed there as it is everywhere. The US, the healthiest structure. And that's because of immigration. What countries do with immigration is going to shape their futures. And the UK is shooting itself in both feet in this regard. It's not only about the demographic structure and fertility rates, it's about the dynamism of societies. This beehive structure is where you want to be. 50%, half of the children being born in the US today are born to immigrant parents, even though they're 11% of the population. Europe, of course, flat, demographics declining rapidly. Africa, the only growing region. But even if one increased immigration, one doesn't offset this fundamental demographic structural change. So the world changes and becomes more elderly. In terms of economic growth, just building on what Justin talked about in the short term, I believe the long-term prospects are incredibly rosy. We're talking about a world growing at least 3% a year for the next 20 years. We've never achieved that historically, and it implies more people getting wealthy at a more rapid pace than ever in history. This is wonderful news. It's incredible news for everyone, but particularly for your businesses around the world. China is close to the US as the biggest economy. Of course, individual per capita income is still a tiny fraction of the US, but in terms of what it's adding to global growth every year, it's bigger. And that's why when the growth rate comes down from, say, 10% to 6%, it doesn't mean that there's a smaller economic pie, because we're growing at 6% on a $17 trillion economy compared to 10% on a $5 trillion economy. And so the marginal, the increase in growth for everything they consume is still there. So I'm very optimistic about China, about India, which I believe will grow at over 6%, about Africa, over 5%, Europe, not the UK, the rest of Europe, 2%, the UK, about 3%, the US, 2 to 3%, Latin America, 3%. This is rosy, of course, with huge unevenness. When you compound these numbers, a lot of countries begin to catch up with where we are in Europe, with per capita incomes of many places in the world higher than that of Greece, Portugal, Spain, and parts of the UK. So Shenzhen in China is already wealthier than Sheffield in the UK, or Minnesota, for example, in the US. Big countries, the comparisons need to be at smaller levels. But per capita incomes, how much the average of people earns, depends on the combination of economic size and number of people. And that's why India doesn't go above $10,000 per capita. China goes up to $30,000 per capita over the next 35 years. Emerging markets are the global growth story. They already account for 70% of global growth. It'll be growing to 80%. This is wonderful news, too, because this rebalancing means that when the US gets a cold, the rest of the world no longer gets fever. There's lots of players, there's lots of locomotives on the global economic train. And of course, the explosion of the middle class. 3.5 billion new middle-class consumers. The story is an Asian one. The shades of yellow and lime green here are Asia. 70% of global middle class in Asia within the next 35 years. The US, the dark blue, being squeezed, Europe, the light blue, much bigger than the US. Can this add up? Can we imagine so many people consuming things in the world? Fish, water, atmosphere. Can it add up? I'm going to come back to that. Let me whiz through some technological changes over the next years. Just thinking about some of the ones we deal with in Oxford. Now, all predictions are fraught with danger, but particularly technological ones. Everyone gets it wrong. The point is not to predict, but to think about the structural changes and where you fit into them. Of course, the pace of technological change is greater. Our predictions will be outdated even more rapidly. We know what's not cool. We think we know what's cool. That will seem as silly in 5 years' time. But there is one rather predictable law, and that's Moore's law, the doubling of processing speed about every 18 months now for the same price. So you can go to the local stores and buy for about £30 a terabyte of storage. That's total global computing capacity of 50 years ago. It'll be half the price for double the capacity next year. This is from my nano lab. This is a molecularly built nano needle going through an individual cancer stem cell at a time of 44 billionths of a second, about 8 billionths of a meter wide. The capability to build at the molecular level, to identify individual cancer stem cells, other cells, and drive drugs into them at individual level. Incredible. This will do away with lots of the therapies, chemo, radio. This is from my stem cell lab. This is the lab technician's skin turned into a heart cell. The ability to build any cell group in the body. This is another sort of revolution. This is genetic revolution. The back mouse is a wild mouse. The front mouse is a slightly genetically modified mouse. The back mouse goes for about 20 minutes, 200 meters. The front mouse goes for 2 hours, 2 kilometers. The same mice, slight genetic modification. The capabilities to enhance, to change chemically, genetically, are now happening in the labs. When they come into society, what the implications will be, how will they shape our lives, those are the things we are working on. But that it's happening is undoubtable. So we have a period of revolutionary change, and of course, spreading globally in wonderful new ways that will change many things, including our jobs. Work that we're doing on automation in the workplace, on robotics, suggests that in the UK, about 36% of jobs will be lost to machine intelligence, to robotics, over the next 20 years. And the question, of course, for ABTA and its members is, what does this do to the travel industry? Who will be replaced? Will all of you in the room be safe in this world? And what about your customers? How will it affect the incomes of your customers? How will it affect their jobs and what's happening on? So we are thinking deeply about the different professions and how it impacts. When we think forward and think about risk, what we realize is increasingly this is a world that we are shaping, the anthropogenic world. The problem about thinking about this world is the past is a very poor guide to the future. It's a much more integrated system. It's a much more complex system. And so what will shape our worlds will not happen from our little silos, our places, our countries, our industries. They'll come from somewhere else, from abroad. And thinking about this means that the old analysis of probability and impact becomes decreasingly useful. This is a world of uncertainty. This is a world of the long tail, but not the Nicholas Taleb black swan long tail, the long tails that we are creating, like the financial crisis, like pandemics, like cyber attacks, etc. Now, systemic risk and shock is not new. We know in the UK that maybe half the British population was killed by a rat coming off a ship into Liverpool Harbour, causing a plague that devastated the population. That's not new. But what's new is the pace and scale of change. And here we see the swine flu starting in Mexico City in 165 countries in 30 days. With the great airports, this is work that our emerging infections group has done in the Oxford Martin School, the great airports becoming super spreaders of swine flu, exactly replicating it, taking the swine flu from Mexico City through JFK, through Heathrow, through other airports around the world. And this point about the super spreading of risks as well as opportunities is absolutely central. But it's also about the new technologies. DNA sequencing is coming down exponentially in price along with Moore's Law. It's wonderful news. Even the National Health Service, I think, will be able to afford DNA sequencing for each of us as individuals within the next 10 years. This process, which cost £2 billion 20 years ago, costs £200 now. It took 3 years. The same process takes 20 minutes now. That's the pace of change. But the same technologies can be used by crazy people with crazy intent to create biopathogens. Let's invent a new smallpox or measles or something else and use a drone to spray it in some stadium or something. That is becoming ubiquitously available. And so how you manage these new risks, some of them driven by new technologies, becomes more and more complex. Individuals have become powerful. I think about them as pirates. Individuals, for the first time, have capabilities of the nation states that only nation states had in previous generations. And that makes risk management much more difficult because we have to think about all of us as being potential risk generators by design or, as the banks have shown, by accident. Barings Bank, which had existed for 250 years, was brought down by one banker just trying to make a bit of money. He didn't want to bring the bank down. And we see this with JP Morgan, we saw it with Societe Generale, we saw it with UBS. Individuals can create mayhem, often unknowingly. And so how we manage this systemic contagion, what I call the butterfly defect, becomes more and more a necessary part of our lives. How do we ensure that we are not victim to these incredible types of new risks? And what we need to recognize is there's no big brother out there, or big brothers sleeping or thinking about something else. The IMF is by far the best of the global institutions, if you compare it to any other. And our central banks, our treasuries, with all their failures, are still the strongest of our national institutions. And yet, they were totally blind to the financial crisis. With all the data, with all the joined-upness, with incredible high salaries they earn, with over 200,000 PhDs whose job it is to have financial stability, they say we didn't see it coming. And so if they don't understand these new risks, how will we? How will we ensure that we're resilient and are able to manage in a time of greater uncertainty? And they will be in every dimension of our lives. The Internet of Things, bringing them to open our computers, to open our front door locks, to open our bank accounts, to control our vehicles, and of course control all your systems. Can you imagine your work without the internet, without your devices, without your computer systems? How do we ensure integrity against cyber? And how do we ensure that people are prepared to put up with it? I was addressing a cybersecurity conference in New York 3 weeks ago at a great big new hotel near Central Park. I was due on stage at 9 a.m., came back from a run in Central Park at 8 a.m., and I couldn't get into my hotel room with my swipe card. Eventually, at 9:30, the fire brigade broke the door down. That's the problem of the new technology and our dependence on it. So how we ensure that these systems have integrity, trust, and that society doesn't turn on them and say, actually, we don't want this stuff. It doesn't deliver for us. But of course, it's part of our whole system now. We have to ensure we are able to work with it, that we understand these systemic connections. I want to return briefly to this adding up problem, to how we all can consume more and be sustainable, as this hotel is obviously trying to demonstrate. When we know the tragedy of the commons, it's a very old problem. Rational individual decisions lead to collective failures. We all want more fish, but if everyone wants more fish, there are no more fish. We all want to do things that collectively will lead to failure. And the big challenge now is in many new areas, like antibiotic resistance. We all want to use antibiotics, but if 1 billion, let alone 2 or 3 billion people use them, no antibiotics will be effective. So how do we offset these challenges between individual and collective decision making? This is the fish market in Tokyo. This tuna went for £1 million. This is the market's response to the scarcity of a natural resource. And in tourism and travel, we see this a lot. How many more people can fit into a resource? My office looks out onto Broad Street in Oxford, and I just wonder how many more buses and coaches can be delivering people into this space. And we see it in Venice, and we see it everywhere else. So travel and tourism is going to have the same problem, which is the management of more and more demand with individual decision-making and rationality. Of course, governments are not very good at this either. This is what the governments sharing the Aral Sea did. Each doing the right thing, drawing water to feed their people, collectively a disaster. So we need new ways of thinking about these. And the Mediterranean right here has demonstrated one of them. This sea was in dire straits outside the hotel only 20 years ago, but it's been rescued. It's been rescued by a combination of scientists, citizens, governments working together, and that provides an indication of what can be done. And with climate change, of course, we have this writ large. The biggest global challenge we've faced for a very, very long time, which will affect all of our lives and certainly the travel industry. Average increase of at least 2 degrees, massive fluctuations, a lot of variability. The weather forecasts will become more and more unstable. And this, of course, requires massive changes in the way we do things. It will affect the nature of travel and tourism, and the rich countries have to do much more than others to allow others to climb the curve. Can it happen? Who's going to organize it? This system of global governance is totally unfit for 21st century purpose. It was designed for another era. It has been unable to reform. And so we're stuck with a hyper-globalized world with common problems and a system where there are cosmetic changes but very little else. So the responsibility comes back to us. The responsibility comes back to us to realize that we're drifting and to take the necessary actions. And as many of these things, the result of the new power balance is partly because of the success of transformation, unintended spillovers. China will no longer be told what to do. The rest of the world is no longer governed by the US, acting with the UK and a few others. And so we're in a much more even global power balance, but in this process, a power vacuum, a period where we have tremendous integration, but vulnerability to collapse. A lot of people look at this and feel more and more uncertain. Citizens are worried. People feel anxious. And you see it in the rise of extremist parties across Europe, the Tea Party in the US, and a return to nationalism, populism, xenophobia. A lot of people are saying we don't like globalization. We don't like uncertainty. Let's put up the walls. Let's retreat. And this is natural. Unfortunately, it's disastrous too. It means we're less and less able to manage our joined-up system. And so the politics is undermining our capabilities to manage in a hyper-globalized world. And how do we do this? We need, of course, to be connected but resilient. And I could put up another image, but not in polite company. This requires an understanding of the need to diversify. And the UK travel industry, of course, has recognized this. It's an extraordinary story that's created opportunity for the UK and kept it in its place, as it has in economics and many other areas, relative to other powers at a time of this tumultuous change. It's not often recognized in Westminster just how important the industry is, and the industry does a bad job in selling itself in this respect. How many jobs it creates, particularly jobs of the vulnerable, young people, women, and others. But it's also not recognized how it's really held its ground and how much British citizens spend, close to £900 per capita on holidays a year. This puts them fourth in the world. Incredible. Of course, China is the new story, by far the biggest number of tourists now in the world. About 36 billion more spend than the US in the last year. So a massive change in where it's coming from, but the UK has been incredibly stable and will be. The risks are big. Obviously, the future of the UK and Europe is a very significant story. EU membership, what happens with the referendum, could change things. The visa regime is extremely negative, not only for incoming, but outbound, because it leads to reputational risks. Indians, Chinese. I've spoken to so many people that say, can we have this conference somewhere else? We don't want to come to the UK. It's too much hassle for us. It's too insulting for us. It defeats our dignity to have to go and wait in queues for visas if we're Chinese professors or something else. The sterling strength is a great asset for outbound, a great vulnerability for inbound. Important. Congestion. Our inability to build infrastructure, be it Heathrow or the new HS2 or anything else. How much more? When I was a student at Oxford a long time ago, it took me 50 minutes to get to London. The same journey now takes an hour. This is happening across the UK. Lack of investment in infrastructure, congestion of incoming people. And remember, incoming and outgoing tourism is closely related. People make the connections, etc. And then the disintermediation. How will the industry be affected by not only the Airbnbs, the Ubers, and everyone else, the shared economy, but this automation process? What do you do that's creative and special? When we do our work on robotics and automation, the one theme that comes out as a constant refrain is anything that's creative, anything that involves social engagement, understanding, learning, and wisdom is irreplaceable by machines. So if you want to protect yourselves for the future, there are two big words in terms of resilience. The one is diversification. You don't know what's going to happen. Take a few bets. One of them will come out. And the second is be creative. Rely on your personal integration with clients and offer them a service that they cannot get from a machine. And if you can do all of that, you'll be able to rock on. So a lot of implications: growth, stable, changing origin, changing destinations, this changing balance, incredibly significant foreign growth, massive growth in foreign tourism, the demographics of who the people are, the technological drivers, the importance of new information sources, TripAdvisor, many others, the disintermediation of many old ones, travel agencies, bureaus, many of these going. Big worries on regulatory risk, and that's happening across the world. The needs of governments to show they're doing something, often do the wrong thing, overreact too late. These new systemic risks, compounding that, they react again. And of course, this extraordinary pace of change. So the resilience comes from being ahead of this, from understanding that you cannot predict the future, but that you can embrace it. And by embracing it, you'll be able to rock on to a very happy old age. Thank you very much.